Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our first attempt at a continuous cover forestry question time. Welcome to our panel of experts, if that's the right thing to say, Gareth Browning, Phil Morgan, and Ben Walker. I'll ask Gareth, Ben, and Phil to introduce themselves just briefly in a minute. Just to say the way we're going to try and play this, we've got a set of questions that some of you have submitted. We'll ask the individuals to, if they want to unmute themselves and ask the questions in most cases. If you'll feel free to put any comments or queries that you've got as we're going through into the Q&A, and we'll endeavour to deal with that. And then we'll aim to finish at 5 or very soon thereafter. So to kick off, I'm Bill Mason. I'm the current chair of the Continuous Cover Forestry Group. Got background in silvicultural research, and I play a little bit at doing CCF in our own family woodlands in the English Midlands. Phil, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm Phil Morgan. I am a forestry manager. I manage woodlands in Wales and in transformation to continuous cover. I have a long-term interest in continuous cover. I was past chairman of CCFG and president of ProSilva, and I manage woods in Wales, but I give advice in different parts of the UK and in Ireland.
Thanks. Ben, you want to unmute and introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Ben Walker. I've been working in the industry since I was about 14 or so. I've worked as a manager across the north of England, and I've sort of done bits of CCF both as a manager and as a practitioner. So I currently work as a forester for Raincliffe Community Enterprise, where I'm the forest manager and the forest operative. So I plant, fell, and kind of manage our woodlands, and do so as close to sort of CCF ethics as possible.
Thanks. And Gareth? You're muted, Gareth, I think. Gareth, I can't hear you.
That better?
Yeah, that's better.
I'm Gareth Browning. I'm an area forester with Forestry England, based in North Cumbria. Look after about 4,700 hectares and have had a long-term interest in continuous cover forestry since the mid-90s. Just love that part, as well as being a partner in Wild Ennerdale, where we look at working with natural processes more in the forest as well as on the fells.
Okay, so that's your panel, I think, is the technical phrase. And the first question we were going to take came from David Shepherd. David, are you there? If not, okay, I'll ask it on his behalf, and Phil, maybe you'd want to start. It says, the question posed was, can continuous cover forestry be used on all sites? And if not, what are the criteria to success?
Right. Well, the obvious answer in my mind is yes. It depends on an awful lot of things, though, on how successful you are. But continuous cover can be employed on most sites. It will take different forms in different situations. So if you think of the lowlands, the chances of having a single stem selection system is far greater than if you're up in the uplands. There will be some form of mosaic developing, and therefore some sort of a shelterwood structure, an irregular shelterwood structure, but both of them can be called CCF. It depends what your starting point is as well. If you're starting at age 30 and there've been no thinnings and things, the chances of success are less. But I think the question is, what are the criteria the criteria for success would be that you've reached a point of equilibrium or steady state after a good number of years. You know, that will not happen very quickly, because all the woods that we tend to manage in Britain are in transformation. There are very, very few examples where we can see the different stages of transformation having taken place. But, you know, we have these examples, we can refer to them, but I suspect that most practicing foresters who are managing according to CCF principles will have a type of transition. The forest will be in transformation at either stage 1, stage 2. But the objective is to reach stage 4, where you have a steady state. And when you take out a number of trees of a large size, the regeneration moves into pole stage, the pole stage move into small wood, the small wood moves into medium wood. And then you come back in 5 years' time and take out some more big trees.
Okay, thanks. Gareth, if I can turn to you next. I mean, does that coincide with your experience in the lakes?
I think so. I would agree with everything that Phil said. One only thing I would add really is I think it is possible to transform older crops, but as Phil said, it is harder, but it's not impossible. And many of my stands that I've been trying to transform have been through a period of no thinning, often for 20 years during the 90s and early 2000s, when thinning wasn't the done thing, or the markets didn't allow for first thinning, certainly on steep ground, which is what a lot I deal with. And it is possible. The big thing I think I found is you've got to thin regularly, and you've got to keep removing that basal area, especially when you start seeing regeneration, to allow space for the understory to go into. And if you don't remove the overstory, then I think that's the big thing with late transformation, is the overstory can be quite dense still. You're starting to get regeneration, but there's nowhere for it to go. And that's the real challenge, is having a stable enough crop to be able to remove quite a large percentage of the overstory at each thinning, to allow space for the understory to grow into before it runs out of space. Whereas if you start earlier, that you can develop that gap year system earlier, things tend to give you more time. There's much less time when you're transforming older crops. Doesn't make it not impossible. The photo behind me, I've only thinned twice. Had been thin 20, 30 years before that. And I just get the sense that that's still doable, but it is about that overstory density and then the stability of that as well.
Okay, thanks. Ben, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree both with Phil and Gareth on this. And the only things I'd really add would be, it's maybe a very basic thing to think about, but is the site itself, is the aspect that you're looking at, winds from, how wet it is, what soils are working, how you intend to work it. You know, if you're starting from a sort of, well, at any point, I suppose, is what are your main parts of access? Where are you going to put racks in? Like, and be thinking about that, whether you're even if you're starting at a very early stage from sort of a recent planting or a young, and just try and keep those things in mind for the whole the process, really.
Okay, David, I can see that you've joined us. Is there anything that you wanted to ask that hasn't been covered in the responses from the panel? Okay, we've got a kind of supplementary question which Deborah has asked, and I'll pick up. How operationally challenging is it to continue thinning with understory regeneration to prevent the new regeneration from being damaged? Gareth, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can do. I think the key thing is that when you first see understory regeneration, it's a sign you're doing the right thing, but it doesn't mean you have to try and keep that regeneration. Often it arrives early, and again, if the overstory density is still quite high, the risk is you focus on that understory regeneration and protecting that at the expense of not thinning and not reducing the overstory basal area. And I have certainly one site that I inherited where the understory was 20 years old, had no space to go into. And that gives us a very tricky situation when the overstory still needs 2 or 3 thinnings. If you allow the understory to grow and establish, and you don't thin during that period, then when you start thinning, you start damaging these 20-year-old trees. That's a lot of sort of energy that's gone into growing those trees that's wasted. Really, you want to keep thinning when the trees are just on the ground, just flexible regeneration, only a few years of growth, so you're not losing a lot. And that's really what you have to do. The key is not to focus on that understory regeneration when it occurs. Get excited by it, certainly, celebrate it. It's a key, it tells you doing the right thing. Carry on focused on the overstory.
Phil, anything you wanted to add?
I would agree entirely with that. I think the focusing on the overstory is the key thing. Look at the trees. That's where the volume is being produced. That's where the quality increment is. Generation comes and goes. I take Gareth's point that if you have intermediate story trees, but you have a very heavy overstory and you have to fell into that, you do stand a chance of damaging things. But the other thing I should say is that there's this misconception that with CCF that you're going to damage the regeneration, or it's going to be very tricky to manage this regeneration because it's so valuable. Gareth is right that it's the overstory that counts. That's what you're managing, and it's surprising the spatial distribution. I think that again Gareth has got this very good picture behind him. That stand has only been thinned twice, but it's already looking quite open. There's quite a bit of space between the trees. That's places where regeneration will establish. But if you drop, you have an awful lot more space within a stand. As you progress through the transformation, when you've been thinning or selectively felling for 2, 3, 4 times, there are lots of big gaps that you can drop the trees into, and you find that operators will avoid the regeneration as best they can, but felling a tree does surprisingly little damage. And I think that examples on the continent will be that you have a felling intervention where you do a selective felling, and that's followed on by a cleaning operation, which is essentially respacing. But you could be respacing some of the damage regeneration, as well as selecting for a diversity of species or other criteria as well.
Okay, Ben, anything you want to add? So briefly,
I would just echo the previous points. Really, the thinner your sort of canopy is, the more you have to fell trees into. And in my experience, it's very rare that any trees that you're worried about do get damaged. There's generally a way to avoid any sort of damage to future stock.
Gareth, I can see you've got your hand up, but I'd quite like to move us on unless this is critical.
I just wanted to add that the understory is important. Some of the damage you do is actually beneficial because it sorts it out and you get more clumpy, diverse structures developing because some will survive. So rather than seeing it as damage, it's just part of the process that generates that multi-story, multi-diverse age. And as Phil exactly said, the actual stem of a very big tree, even our big Douglas that are nearly 50 meters tall, the actual stem is only a meter wide, and you can fit that through a lot of trees. It's the big stuff at the top, the crown, and having permanent extraction racks where you can land those crowns is really critical on flat ground, but much harder on steep ground.
Okay. Thank you all, guys, and thanks for the comments and input from participants. I'd like to move on to our next question, which Chris Yarrow has asked. Chris, I think I've seen you with us. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Welcome.
Can you remind me of my question?
Is there it's in 2 parts, and I was going to take the second bit first. The first part, is there an estimate of the area now managed under CCF and GB? And I'll park that for the minute. And then can we say that CCF has been financially successful?
Well, I don't think I've any much to add to those questions, 2 questions.
Right.
Other than the fact that I don't get out very much. I like to promote continuous cover, but the few woodland owners I talk to remain pretty unconvinced because I can't point them in the right direction and quote figures to them.
Well, I'd like to take the response firstly from Gareth, then from Phil, who I know's got financial experience, and lastly Ben. So Gareth, financially, aspects of CCF.
I don't know certainly answer the first question, but in terms of financially, I can point to 2 stands that are probably around, I've just measured them on our map, around 30 to 35 hectares. Not a big part of my 4,700 hectares, but still 35 hectares, where we now have 2 or 3 stories within those stands. So effectively, we have managed to regenerate those 2 stands. We still have an overstory, we have an understory which we've started thinning, and we haven't paid anything towards establishments. Those 2 stands have just been generators of income. They've never generated a cost. Never have I spent expenditure on them. So I think that in itself proves that you can do it. I'm really quite excited about those 2 stands because to me it starts to say, if I can do it here, I can do it elsewhere. The simple answer is I'm not spending money on those, so they are making a financial return and no cost.
Okay. Phil,
Yeah, I would say that there isn't any doubt about it in my mind that it is financially more profitable, but it's a different business model. It's how you make that comparison, which is sometimes difficult if you're speaking to a client, as Chris says, that he has to make a case for it. If you're going to make a case for something, you either have to have some very good examples, or you need to have a model that you can put forward. And unfortunately, and this is something that Darius is, is it going to be in one of his questions later? What is the state of modelling? We have plenty even-aged models. We have yield tables and things that we can refer to, but we don't have those equivalent models or tables that we have for CCF. We tend to monitor in CCF, and we monitor so that we have a management tool, but we can also, when we're monitoring, provide the evidence for what we're doing. But that takes a time to accumulate the data to be able to come up with some really strong information that you can pass on to clients, or that you can pass on to investors who want to invest in CCF. As Gareth pointed out, there are so far fewer costs. With the advantage of clear fell and replant is that the woodland owner gets a very big check when liquidation takes place, but they also get very big bills afterwards, and a lot of those bills are you don't have those bills with CCF. You have different types of costs. There's a little bit of respacing that you have to do, but you're not respacing over the full hectare. You maybe only be respacing over 10% of it. And that regeneration comes in at no cost at all. And some of the very big woods that I manage have had red book valuations, and the valuers have acknowledged this fact, and that is they've worked it into the valuation for these woods which are in transformation. They're not there yet. But even so, anybody who is valuing an irregular woodland takes account of these cost savings, and takes account of the value of the standing timber as well. There's a far higher proportion of large timber in that. So we're looking at 2 very different things when we're making the comparison, and we're more and more coming around. We're accumulating data, and we're developing models so that we can make these cases for the commercial viability of CCF. And if I can just, I don't want to say too many things, but the other thing that we don't value as well is the things that CCF provides that clear fell and replant does not, in terms of ecosystem services. And we are increasingly putting a value on these things now, and so this will be another stream of revenue that CCF can provide the woodland owner or the investor.
Thanks, Phil. Ben?
Yeah, so again, I'd agree with the previous statements. I think the I can sort of anecdotally think of some woods that the woods I'm working at the moment are financially viable. Like they pay my wage and for the machinery and for any sort of future works. And I can think of other woodlands in the Chilterns where that's the case. And these are just places that I've been working and have been sort of privy to the finances of. But looking sort of, I suppose, for evidence in other places, there's I had a little look around, and there's a paper by Lucy Vitkova, 2021 in the International Journal of Forestry, which showed that it is more economically viable and that you have a steadier trend in both harvesting and volumes from areas of woodland, especially in uneven-aged forest stands, which I think, again, is sort of echoing what we're saying here. Jumping very, very quickly to the first point of that question as well. Again, I had a little dig around to try and find some figures on how much of sort of UK forest is continuous cover. And the most recent figures that I could find were from 2015, which is obviously not all that recent, but it estimated around 10% of forest cover was managed to CCF. And that's around 60,000 hectares in Great Britain and just under 10,000 in Ireland, most of which in Ireland had been recently converted. So that was between sort of the years 2000 2015. And a little sort of shout out to public forests is that 20% of that 60,000 hectares in Great Britain is CCF is managed in public forests. So it's those folk that we need to thank.
Okay, thanks, panel. Chris, anything you wanted to come back on?
No, that's very helpful. Obviously, we could discuss this till the cows come home, and I'm sure there are lots of other questions. Thank you for the team for that.
Okay, now there was a question that Darius raised. I'm going to, the panel, forgive me, I'm going to skip a little bit, which we touched on in the previous answer, which was on modelling growth and yield. Darius, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or do you want me to do it for you?
I'm fine. I'm happy if you want to go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, the question was, what's the most reliable way to model growth and yield for commercial conifer forests undergoing transformation to CCF in the UK and Ireland? And I'm going to use a bit of chair's prerogative and give my response and see if the panel disagree with me. Firstly, as somebody's already said, there's no growth model readily available to allow people to model growth and yield of irregular stands. Therefore, any predictions at scale have got to be based on adaptation of existing models. However, as I think both Gareth and Phil and Ben have said, at least in the early stages of transformation basically involves thinning, and often of single species stands. So you can, to a degree, you can fudge the existing models to take account of the thinning process. You don't want, and the yield class, since productivity is unlikely to change grossly between an even-aged and irregular stand, you can just essentially use the existing models with a bit of fudging. The main issue, and again, Gareth's backdrop screensaver shows the point. One of the things you've got to do to achieve regeneration is to drop the basal area below what's in the even-age yield table. So you've got to allow for that adjustment. So in a sense, I think with a little bit of intelligent adaptation, you can use the existing models for the first, let's say, 10 to 15, 20 years. It's when it gets beyond that it gets more complicated. In a big property, you could develop a local yield table, as is being practiced in parts of the continent. Okay. Ben, anything you want to add?
No, I'd agree. There's
Yeah.
sort of
Okay,
So-
fine.
budging. Sorry.
I'm sort of, because we've got quite a lot of questions to do, I'm going to push this a little bit. Phil, was there anything you wanted?
Yeah, I agree with you, Bill, that there is a divergence after about 15, 20 years that you go through this. If we're talking about even age crops and that have been, recently planted, but you go through the normal thinning process. If we're transforming to continuous cover, I think that we have different mechanisms at our disposal, graduated density and things like that, but we're not diverging too straight away from the yield models. But after those first two thinnings, that's when things do start to become different, because we are controlling the basal area in a different way. We come to a point when we're thinning over marginal thinning intensity, and this is when things become different. And what we don't have is we don't have an idea at the moment exactly what the same size distribution is in these different stages of transformation. You mentioned, Bill, that there is a drop in basal area, and that's what I mean by overcutting in the sort of the classical sense. That is sometimes required during a transformation process. You need to prime the whole thing. You need to make it happen quickly, so that we have these dips in productivity, which are then recovered as you go through the different stages. Because when you think of the transformation, you've got all the trees of the same age. The transformation takes 60 years. You've got to have elements of that first cohort still there when that regeneration becomes productive. So that does take a long time before you get that point of equilibrium. And I think that there are a lot of models out there, but those models have to be tweaked. They have to be adjusted, and they need to be adjusted with real data. And we need to create these databases, and the Germans are particularly good about this because they have been accumulating data for a very, very long time. But so there are models there, but they're not necessarily designed for transformation to continuous cover. We need to understand that, and we need to adapt them to suit our purposes. And in order to do that, we need to have data to back up our assertions in how this trajectory, how it is, how we go from even age to irregular over what period.
Okay, thanks. Gareth, bring you in, and particularly, do you want to say something about how you predict the yields from your 5,000 hectares of you manage? Are you adjusting existing models to do this?
Well, we have a production forecast, which is run at a sort of district level, and we can feed into that different models for each stand. And a few years ago now, we did create models for CCF stands, where we changed the interventions, and I think it's a while since I did it, but you could specify what percentage of basal area or volume came out at each of these interventions, and what type of interventions they were. Were they line, frame, line or crown, or intermediate? So you could build a sort of model of sorts that reflected a transformation approach. And I think it's worth remembering we are in a transformation phase across the country for the most part. And so we're transforming, not actually at that lovely position that Phil talked about earlier, of a stable state. So we are transforming. And so those models will have to keep changing, of course, because they won't be the same always, because hopefully we'll get closer to the stable state. At a sort of a yearly place, I tend to start with so planning the next year's work and working out what's coming out. That's just the same really as any thinning. Get the crop data, decide how much coming out based on what the stand needs, and a spreadsheet does all that for me.
Thanks. Darius, do you want to come back?
No, just a comment to say, I think one of the limitations on why CCF hasn't been picking up more widely is probably that there aren't any reliable models. And I just wonder, does anyone know of any stands anywhere that are in advanced stages, stage 3 and stage 4, or are they just none of them out there? So we'll have to wait for decades before the data to validate our models.
Bill, briefly, do you want to?
Yeah, if I could say that, you know, the models are, as Darius says, that this has maybe contributed to a reluctance for people to invest in forestry and transformation. If you are managing woodlands, you know, the models are there in order to make a case, a financial case for an investor or for somebody who's thinking of embarking on that journey. But as far as managers are concerned, the managers need to monitor and measuring trees on a periodic basis. You know what the production has been. You know what the increment from your forest is. You understand what the increment is in relation to the standing volume, and you can plan your future cut on that basis. And you know, and this will change through the transformation period, but as long as you repeat your measurements on a fairly regular basis, you know, we have fast growing species in this part of the world, so you need to do an inventory every 5 years ideally. But you know, doing that inventory 7-8 years on a 7 or 8 year cycle is perfectly useful as well. So the models are really for people who, you know, it's to justify, is to make the financial case. And as I pointed out in my earlier answer, you know, we are coming up with these answers now.
Okay, thank you, panel. Thank you for the question, Darius. Now, we had a set of questions which essentially related to barriers to wider adoption of CCF, which we've kind of touched on. But I think they came variously from England, Scotland, and Wales. And I was going to take Richard Hartley. Richard, if you're there, do you want to unmute and ask the question of the panel?
I think Richard's not there.
Okay, thanks, Polly. Well, I'll ask the question on his behalf. What do you think is the greatest barrier to wider adoption, of CCF approaches? And is there anything you think could help to overcome this? Ben, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. I think with a lot of these things, it's multifaceted. I think there's as spoken about, there's a great deal of perception about the economic benefits of CCF. I think there's an awful lack of skill in our sector as well these days, and having the right operatives to work in the woodlands is a requirement as well. And this, I think, spreads up to a manager level in some cases, where you maybe have people who are reluctant to learn, or maybe because we don't have set tables to work from, it makes things a little bit trickier, and you maybe have to go off experience or being able to speak to other people about what you should maybe practice on your site. Essentially, I think it's just a little bit trickier than it is to follow a sort of standard, especially in sort of monoculture conifers. But I think the way to overcome this is to continue to try and show people that it is economically viable. It's certainly more engaging as a manager and as a practitioner to work in continuous cover woodlands. And I think it's much more pleasant to work in as well, and much more pleasant for people to walk through and engage with, plus all the environmental benefits that Phil previously mentioned also.
Thanks, Ben. Gareth, barriers to wider uptake.
The number one barrier is simply we aren't thinning enough, and we've lost the confidence as a professional industry. Not everybody, but I think generally as you go round, there's a lot of areas that aren't being thinned, and I think that has been increasing the amount of the lack of thinning, and we've lost a lot of experienced people over the last decade or two, and I do think that's a big challenge, because if we're not thinning and we don't know how to thin, And actually CCF is just 2 or 3 steps beyond thinning. And if you're not doing the thinning, then we're trying to jump from an unknown into something that's unknown without exploring the thinning. And without thinning, we can't do CCF. So I think Gary Kerr said in his recent presentation webinar, he said there's 3 things: thin, get diversity, and shoot the deer. And I think that's absolutely right. We need to simplify CCF down to thinning to start with. And once you are thinning, and if you keep thinning and you start to do some crown thinning later on, then regeneration occurs and you almost get driven towards it. And that's what I've started to do across my beats, is to actually thin everything, because if it's CCF, even though some of it isn't and has a clear fell endpoint, I ignore that and thin everything as though it's CCF, and thin every stand age as though it's CCF, and wait and see what happens. And I think active thinning is so key. You can't unlock the door of CCF if you don't thin. If you're not thinning, you're never going to get into the CCF room.
Okay, thanks, Gareth.
Hmm.
Bill?
Yeah, well, I agree with both previous speakers. I think waiting and see, just see what happens is a brave thing to say, but that is what we need to do. I really like that. But I think what we're doing is we're confronting a culture that has resisted CCF, and there are all sorts of historical reasons for that. But there aren't enough examples. The growing stock that we have is of a particular type, and there are some real challenges in changing that. So those are all reasons why there hasn't been more acceptance or more more attempts at doing continuous cover. Of course, there are the great examples. Some of them are in the state sector, and Glen Tress and Pascali and places like that. But they are exceptions. And then in the private sector, there are some very good examples as well, where people have been doing this for years, and they have acquired those skills. They hadn't been taught those skills necessarily in any great detail, because the educational establishments don't send their foresters out to transform. They send them out to clear fell and replant, and that leaves us with a business model that is established. And these things are very difficult to turn around. There's a whole the growing stock is there. There are a whole load of people who manage that for a living, and making that case, we've always attempted to make the case to fellow foresters. We should be making the case to woodland owners and woodland investors, and I think the tide is beginning to turn, because we have a climate emergency, we have a biodiversity crisis, and continuous cover can provide some really good solutions to some of those terrible problems. And more people who are interested in trees realize that CCF is important. And it's slowly beginning to change, but it's been an uphill battle for a very long time.
Okay. Now I'm going to move on to slightly more technical question, which came from Graham Gill on load bearing versus wind throw. Graham, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. We've been having a bit of a chat about this in the on the side, and really my question was, thinking about upland forests, do you think that the bearing capacity of soils is actually a greater constraint on adopting CCF than wind throw hazard? I'm thinking about the lack of brash that we certainly found was a real problem once you got to maybe the second or third intervention, and there just wasn't enough brash to support forestry machines.
Okay, and I know Gareth has partially answered this on the chat, but Gareth, do you want to briefly reiterate what you've written?
Yeah, I can do. So I think ultimately there is an endpoint where somewhere is just too wet and the soils are just not supported, where you have to accept that that's maybe not the right approach. Maybe even timber production off that site is not the right approach. Some other woodland might be better. But below that point, I think there are things you can do, and I certainly have done. And if you're doing it as part of a larger thinning program, you can accommodate these things perhaps. And that is to, for example, maybe move away from every brash rack being an extraction rack. So we've got a site which I've experimented with where we've done alternate brash racks. So the forwarder still went up and down each rack, but the harvester went up and down each rack, but the forwarder was only allowed up and down alternate racks. And the harvester had to fell and pass the tree towards the extraction rack and then process it on the extraction rack, and effectively doubled the amount of brash in each extraction rack. You could take that further, go to every third extraction rack where there'd be manual felling and maybe some winching, or you might go to the point where you say, well, no wheels at all. We've got to a stage where there's not enough brash. The timber volume per hectare, as I put it, is higher than the brash per hectare. And we have to maybe look at something else, perhaps winch extraction, where you pull the tree's whole tree harvest off and you put no wheels on the ground at all, or you pole length them off, but there's no wheels going on the ground at all for part of its stands life until there's more brash starts to appear in the understory again.
Okay, thanks. Ben, you want to?
My experience on this is somewhat limited, but I think wind is definitely not to be underestimated. I think wind can certainly be a very high, a higher barrier to being able to work woodlands than its ground load bearing potential. Yeah, I've worked in woodlands in the lakes where there's been where you could drive machines quite happily up and into the woodlands with good access, but the aspect and the fact in this woodland that I'm thinking of, the fact that this woodland hadn't been thinned for quite a long time had left it greater exposed really to throw than if it had been worked, and there were areas surrounding on the same slopes that were uneven broadleaf woodlands that didn't suffer. This was during our wind, that didn't suffer the same damage. And I think this is, yeah, there's every site needs to be considered, and it's very difficult to work without seeing them and sort of considering it in depth, I think.
Okay, thanks. Phil?
It's a very, very, very interesting question. I think it's particularly applicable to the uplands, where you get a mosaic of different site types, little ridges or areas where you get mineral soils or rocky soils, and then little pockets of peat in between. And as Gareth implied, we shouldn't really be planting trees, or we should be looking at managing our commercial trees in a different way, depending on these site types. And there are, in some of the forests that I manage, there are trees planted on that have got yield class 8 or 9 or 10. They're trees that are 60 years old, and they've got 10 centimeters DBH. And so if you take a peat probe and stick it in the ground, you find you've got deep peat there. You would know that anyway just by walking along the drains. We would not plant those sites in this day and age. We would look at fixing carbon in a different way, and restoring such areas and having this mosaic of open ground is quite difficult to manage, if you don't have any stock on the site. But even if you do block drains and you try to restore the water table in those areas, you will have a woodland that doesn't transpire in the same way that a sort of wall-to-wall Sitka spruce would do. And so you may have willow or birch on those areas, but you'll be managing the carbon in a more effective way. And you would also be managing the environmental risk as well, because those areas, as has been pointed out, Graham said, you run out of brash. well, if you're running out of brush on that site, maybe you shouldn't be there. Gareth said that, there's ways of mitigating these sort of things by skipping racks and drawing in. This is something that I've done on those sort of sites. But there comes a point where some of those stands are just not commercially viable, and we need to think of alternatives, and we need to, to take advantage of that and manage the carbon on those sites in a different manner and reduce the productive area of that woodland, but to be sure that the areas that you go into are ones that you can manage sustainably and they're suitable for CCF. So going back to the very first question that was posed, some areas are not suitable. You can work too hard at making them work, and that is detrimental from an economic point of view, but it's also detrimental from an environmental one as well. So I'll revise my very first answer to the question. I was a bit over enthusiastic when I said you could do it anywhere.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Graham, do you want to come back at all?
Well, I think the idea of every second rack is an interesting one and might extend the area a bit. I still think there's some sites where the ground conditions just mean probably clear fell and replants the way to do it, and not every site is capable of CCF.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Graham. Thanks for the question. I'd like to move from the uplands, at least from the conifer uplands, to broadleaf woodland. And Andrew Shaw raised a question about woodlands affected by ash dieback. Andrew, are you with us?
Yeah, yes, I am. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you well, thanks.
Yes, thanks very much. Yes, in the Midlands, as you're aware, ash dieback is quite a problem, and a lot of the woodlands have over 50% ash stocking, and the question is really, how long do we wait to allow natural regeneration to come in, which tends to be willow and thorn and possibly some resistant ash, or is there a sort of benefit really in restocking these ash woodlands and starting again, bearing in mind that a lot of them are triple SIs. I'd be interested in comments.
Yeah.
Ben, do you want to, or Phil, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think that there are a number of things there. Looking at CCF as a possible solution. If you're managing those woodlands, and you're managing ash to continuous cover principles, you will find that the trees that you're favoring got deeper crowns. If they've got deeper crowns, they're going to be stronger trees. They're going to be more robust. And very often ash stands are underthinned and closed canopy and very, very small etiolated crowns, and all those trees are very vulnerable. And so if there is any resistance in the population, the chances are that you may lose more. With trees that are more vigorous, they are more robust and they're able to withstand the disease, subject to them having the genetics to be able to resist it. And there is more resistance within ash than there is within larch, for example. So, but that's still that is still valid with larch, but maybe to a different degree. But I think the question was also about this regeneration. Do we restock? What do we restock with? Are the nurseries that are producing disease-resistant ash yet? We're not quite there yet. I know a lot of work is being done on this, but we're not yet there. So natural regeneration, ash regenerates very freely. There is sometimes a transition between different species. Ash doesn't always regenerate under ash. sycamore might come in, and ash will come in under sycamore. But and if it's a triple SI, that may be an issue, dare I say. I think that the continuous cover relies on natural regeneration. There will be an element of resistance within that new growing stock, and using natural processes may well be something that we need to manage.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Ben, do you want to...
Yeah, sure. So I think, yeah, this is a very difficult one. And I think the first thing is to check to see what ash you have there, what your stock is, and see whether it's appropriate for converting to CCF or moving towards CCF. And just like Phil said, if you have trees that are of decent health and are good size, then these could be your sort of future canopy, you know. And again, I suppose echoing Phil's point there is ash really suffers when it's in high density, if it has, or when it gets dieback. And I think part of the reason is to do with how ash dieback spreads, and trees become much more susceptible, and they can become diseased quite quickly through the bark if there isn't enough airflow sort of passing through the woodland. So I think increasing the amount that you thin is an advantage, not only for the stock that you're going to leave there, but it's also for your working it in future. If you leave a lot of this stuff, you're going to end up potentially, if it is affected badly by dieback, you'll end up with really brittle trees that are very hard to work, and that can be an issue in future. Again, restocking, I think in the triple SI that is tricky. I've come across quite a few places that have restocked and used different species and maybe more site appropriate species, and kind of ruling ash out essentially. But obviously on a triple SI, this is difficult, and I can empathise with you because I'm having a similar situation at work at the moment. I'm trying to sort something out is difficult, but I think having those discussions with the right people is the most important thing, and often those that you'll speak to will be happy to make allowances in situations such as this, in my experience.
Yeah, thanks very much.
I'd add one thing, Andrew, which is you need to bear in mind the deer browsing pressure.
Yes,
and the extent to which that may affect the regeneration. And if you haven't got or haven't used small fenced exclosures just to check the interaction between deer browsing and regeneration, then that's probably a good idea. Gareth, I think you'd indicated previously that you didn't particularly want to field this question.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of ash in the forest. We have odd trees, we have some on the boundaries, and for the most part we manage them as a tree safety issue. The only thing I was going to say was that, and I repeat this a lot to visiting groups, that I work mostly with shade tolerant conifers. When you move to native species, especially broadleaf, well, all our native species, apart from beech, the majority are light demanders. So that changes the approach quite considerably in CCF. I have been quite impressed by alder in an alder birch oak mix that I have over a messenger wire, which is quite wet. And we had birch regeneration. We then raked the Brashmax and planted oak in that and alder. And the alder, which were planted something like 6 or 7 years after the birch regeneration, have caught up the birch and are now surpassing the birch in growth. I found that amazingly impressive. And I see from the forest development types that alder's mentioned in alongside ash. So that might be worth investigating. And they talk there about cohorts and groups. And again, I think that's the type of approach you'd probably use if you had an ash woodland that you wanted to put something else in and see more life in. But I'm not an expert on that.
No, I definitely agree with Gareth on that, especially on north-facing sites or somewhere that's particularly wet or shady.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're getting towards 5 o'clock. I don't want to delay the panel or people too long, but there's a question that I think raises another interesting area, which came from Geraint Price from Wales. Geraint, are you on the call?
I am, Bill, yes.
Do you want to ask away?
Well, if you could remind me of my question again. I got a rough idea, but if you wouldn't mind reading it out, Bill, that'd be
reads,
very grateful.
moving forward, are we considering wildfire mitigation within the remit of CCF? And do you want to give a bit of background to the question?
Well, look, we're all aware that with climate change and global warming, it's moving fast north, coming northern. What we need to consider is, like, obviously with the uneven stands and the ladder fuel effect in CCF, should we not consider putting in kind of like fuel breaks and taking that into consideration when undertaking CCF?
Okay. Gareth, is this something you've considered addressing?
Not specifically. Interestingly, I'm trying to find it now. I was contacted just recently by somebody who is working on a placement from a German university who wants to interview me about rewilding and mitigation of wildfire. So that should be quite interesting to see where she's coming from on that. I think CCF would in itself be a better mitigation for wildfire anyway, because if you've got a gappy, clumpy system that's got more green vegetation in the mix and is shaded and cooler, then I think that would be less likely to produce a lot of burn. And if you're moving in and thinning more regularly, then you're removing volume more regularly. Then I think as a whole, you've got a more organic shapes and gaps and glades. It's going to be much harder for wildfire to cross those gaps and glades if they've got green, young shoots and vegetation in them than if it's a uniform stand that's just got bare needles on the ground, which is typical of our monoculture stands. That would be my thinking.
Bill?
Yeah, I would support that. I think I didn't speak to him personally, but I know that Alexander Held from ProSilva recently went to Africa, and he was speaking to people in South Africa about wildfires and spreading into forests. And they said, well, look at the native forest, look at the natural forests that they have, which are irregular forests. And when the fire reaches the forest, the fire stops. And if you think of some of the real disasters that have occurred in the southwest of France, for example, those are all monocultures. And the AFI, who monitor irregular stands, have got a few plots in the land, and they weren't affected in the same way that the monoculture were simply burnt out, and they created an inferno. As Gareth says, the mass is so great, and it's a bit like there is an argument that disease doesn't spread so well in continuous cover because you have a diversity of species and the diversity of age classes. Not every crown is touching one right next to it. So, the vector for fire or for disease isn't there.
Okay. Ben, anything you want?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, and where you're located in the country is certainly something to consider as well. I know here in the northeast in Yorkshire, there's the predictions until 2070 seem to suggest that we will be warmer, but we'll also be and I think that needs to be taken into consideration when thinking about fire as well. Whereas maybe if you're in the southwest, it might be more of a concern. But yeah, this question I found really interesting because there's very few fire breaks you see up around here anyway, and I started thinking about it a little bit and started questioning whether or not I should be putting fire breaks in woodlands, and so that led me to doing a little bit of reading, and essentially what a few papers I've come across suggest that essentially the more resilient or the more complex your woodland is, the more resilient it is to fire and also to pests and disease. Yeah, that's all I'm saying.
Okay, and then Thank you, panel. Geraint, does that help? I hope.
No, that's very interesting, and thank you, gentlemen. And I think we've got some interesting times ahead. Thank you.
Okay, and I was proposing that we might take one last question, which came from Andrew James. Andrew, are you still on the call?
Yes, I'm still here. Yeah.
Do you want to ask away?
We've touched on it a little bit. I'm in the Northwest Highlands, and the woodland I'm thinking about is a shelter belt for a heritage garden. So there's thinning is going to be required, but there can't be a risk to the garden through opening up gaps or wind throw. But is there anything that can be done to sort of minimise that possibility and reassure the head gardener about that?
Okay, I'll start with Gareth, I think. I know he's been wondering about wind the last few days.
Yes. Andrew, what species is the shelter belt?
So it's predominantly Scots pine with some Corsican pine as well.
Okay. So it's a light demander essentially, and you probably want native species in the mix. Do you know how wide it is?
It's not very wide. It's about 20 acres in all around the garden. So it's thicker and thinner in different places, but it can be only a few hundred meters really.
Okay, well, a few hundred meters is better than I often think of those sort of wind shelter belts as being 20 or 30 meters wide. Is the pine very old? Is it regenerating?
So it is quite old. Most of it was planted around about 150 years ago.
Okay.
And yeah, and there's no regeneration really at the moment.
Right. Do we know if there's seed production?
Yes, there's seed production, and we have collected some seed for our own purposes. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good. So we know there's seed production. We know from your description the pine are old enough to be producing seed and probably viable seed. It's probably just too dense or too dark, even with the side light from the shelter belt, to get regeneration inside the actual crop. So if it's a few hundred meters wide, then you've got something to work with. But you do need it. I don't think I could work in a shelter belt that's only 20 or 30 meters wide. So it needs to be that sort of 100 meters wide.
Yeah.
And I'm not an expert on light demanders. As I say, most of my time is spent with shade tolerance, but light demanders are generally managed through some gap or group systems, or even shelter or strip systems. So maybe a strip or group system will be the start point, and maybe just start. I think for all of us, I've certainly put my hand in the air and say some of the stuff I've done and learned from has been experimental, and it doesn't always work. So experiment just quietly in a corner and knock a few holes in somewhere in the middle of the crop, or take a strip off and see what happens. There is the risk of wind throw, and you have to be happy and adapt to that and see it as part of the system. But I think you've got the right age of pine to produce regen, and you could knock a hole in it and then underplant and plant your trees from the nursery that you've been growing from the seed in, and see if they respond. But you probably want to measure your basal area in the area you're going to be planting, if you're planting or looking for regeneration, because for pine, like for larch, it's going to want to be below 20 square meters per hectare, probably in the teens of square meters per hectare, to expect anything to grow really.
I think if I can just chip in, I think Hazel's comment on the Q&A is quite appropriate. Andrew, is this shelter belt fenced?
It is because it's the garden as well. So yes, the whole thing is fenced. Yeah.
And so there's not a deer issue hidden in the back.
They do occasionally get in, but it's a very low level. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Phil, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, it sounds like rather a wide shelter belt if it's 100 meters wide. So it seems like a small woodland, and it's the Scots pine are old; they're 150 years old. So I agree with Gareth that you need to be cautious. If you're starting to start working in that wood at that age, and presumably it's been thinned in the past, or the trees are reasonably far apart, but I would be cautious, and I would attempt to lower the basal area by doing what I wouldn't normally do, is a low thinning, and taking out some of the poorer trees that will never be able to respond if you actually open them up, and to lower the basal area in that way, but also to do it in a clumpy way. Gareth mentioned groups, and I think that is probably what you need to do. But you need to be opportunistic, and you need to let the stem quality dictate the size or the shape of the group, and not be afraid to leave particularly good trees that are well developed, and if they've got good crowns on them, they'll have a good root structure as well, isolated within a group, for example. And then if you're not getting the regeneration, try to you could, if you've got a fence around it, put some pigs or something in there for a while and scarify the ground, and go for your from your own seed source. Or otherwise, go to the nursery and maybe put some shrubs in. If you want it for shelter, and you've got a tall canopy and a field layer underneath it, you need to fill that space between the top of the canopy and the ground. And maybe shrubs are going to be a good thing. So diversify the species mix, and unless there are particular reasons, if it's a National Trust property, maybe you want to maintain that Scots pine there. But if you're willing to diversify, I think that's an opportunity.
Yeah, I given where you are where I think you are on the West Coast, expecting regeneration or even seed years from Scots pine might be, you might be optimistic. I mean, you might well have to do some enrichment, I think. Ben, anything you wanted to bring in?
I'd agree with the rest of you on this, really. I think my experience of shelter belts are much thinner generally, about sort of 30 or 40 meters wide. Anecdotally, one I was managing in Chester, which had mainly Scots pine, but 1 or 2 ash dotted through it, and the ash had died back. Once the ash came out, the 1 or 2 of the pine decided to blow as well. I haven't been back to that woodland recently, but I think essentially, again, sort of echoing what the others here is tread lightly, especially if you're in quite an exposed, and also pick what you're thinning well. I think there's obviously an advantage in some situations to removing sort of wolf trees or those that are very wind firm. But if you're noticing big, like heavy branching on trees and they've clearly been sat on a corner for a long time, maybe leave them be until because they'll be giving a lot of protection to the rest of the wood, I should think.
Yeah. Okay. Andrew, does that help?
No, that's really very helpful. That's great. And also I see a comment from Hazel that's quite good as well in the chat. So, but thank you for all of that. That's fantastic.
Okay. Well, thank you for your questions. Thanks everybody else for their questions. Apologies to the people who posed questions that we haven't dealt with, but we're getting well past the hour mark now. And I think, to be fair to the panel and all of you, I ought to bring this to an end. Hope you found this interesting. It was a bit of an experiment, and I'd really like to thank Gareth, Phil and Ben for stepping up to the plate and being prepared to be put on the spot so frequently. So on your behalf, on behalf of the CCFG, thank you, Gareth, thank you, Phil, thank you, Ben. Thanks everybody for joining, and thanks Polly for making the arrangements.